Afternoon. Before we get underway with the speaking engagement for today, I'd like to acknowledge some help that the program has received from an outstanding faculty member here at school who's helped us, been a most important part in producing this program for today. We have with us Professor Don Kalish. Prof, why don't you stand up and take a bow? Thank you very much for your help. The gentleman we have with us today graduated in 1936 from Yale University, cum laude in economics. He went on with a Henry Fellowship and studied at New College at Oxford in England. In 1939, he enrolled in the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He was jailed twice, once in 1940 for a year, once in 1943 for 2 years, for refusing to register for the draft. He is currently an editor and has been an editor for Liberation since its beginning in March 1956. He is chairman of the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, the organization which sponsored the March on the Pentagon in October of 1967. He is also coordinator of the New York City Fifth Avenue Vietnam Peace Parade Committee, and he is serving on the International War Crimes Tribunal. He's traveled in Cuba, Japan, Cambodia, South Vietnam, China, and North Vietnam. In September of 1967, he helped organize a week-long meeting between Americans and Vietnamese, both from the North and the National Liberation Front, in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia. In mid-June of this year, he spent a week in Paris having conversations with members of both delegations and with others present. Today we will hear a report from the Paris Peace Talks from Mr. Dave Dellinger.
Thank you. Do I have to use this, or can I stand up?
Fine, whatever you prefer.
Yeah. I think I'm more comfortable standing up. If we were around the circle, it's nice to be down, but this way I can see you all, and anyway, I'll try it. And that's okay, you don't have to...
Yeah, if you people can hear, you want to move up a little closer.
Well, if you have trouble, just raise your hands and I'll raise my voice. Reciprocity. Well, in approaching the Paris peace talks, obviously one has to put them into some kind of a context. And I'll attempt to do a little bit of that now and slide over some areas perhaps, and I hope there's time for questions and discussion, and can bring in other areas if you want. But in approaching the talks now taking place, or one could almost say not taking place in Paris, despite the presence of two delegations, one has to consider the history of the U.S. approach to peace and war in Vietnam. And the Vietnamese put it very succinctly. They say that every time President Johnson makes a peace speech, we expect a military escalation. And this is generally the history. And sometimes people in the anti-war movement sort of lose sight of the fact that the American approach is a two-pronged approach. Talks of peace, even gestures, slight movements toward peace, along with escalation. If we look back on the 1964 presidential campaign, which to some extent is on people's minds because of the 1968 campaign, I've always thought that the anti-war movement much too glibly said that Johnson broke his promises, because at the same time he was speaking about no wider war, both in words and in deeds he was pursuing a wider war. There had been already, for example, the bombing of North Vietnam in response to the manufactured Gulf of Tonkin incident. And I think it's a little easy out that people take, accusing him of breaking his promise, when in fact it was our own superficiality of analysis which allowed some people at least to think that Johnson could be an anti-war candidate. Well, be that as it may, there's always been this dual thing, this simultaneous approach: talk peace, make some movement toward peace, but at the same time escalate the war. And I believe that this is the reality of the present situation which has led up to the Paris talks, but that this reality really hasn't broken through to the American public, and in particular to that section of the American public which ought to be best informed, namely the anti-war movement. The fact is that what has happened is that a certain type of bombing has been stopped, or certain areas of bombing where bombing took place have been abandoned, but there is actually an increased tonnage and an increased number of missions. And I don't think that this is accidental. Writing in an article which appeared last January, but was probably written sometime last fall, in a symposium, Can We Win in Vietnam, Herman Kahn outlined a program for victory. I don't think I have to say who Herman Kahn is, the thinking the unthinkable man, and who does all these exercises for the military, presently through the Hudson Institute. But in this towards a program of victory, he proposed that the present or the then current level of bombing be stopped, and that the bombing be concentrated, the way he put it was, in the city of Vinh and south of Vinh, which is pretty much the area that Johnson confined the bombing to after his April Fool's Eve speech. Now, it's not just a matter that, for example, before his speech, the average number of missions was 2,500 a month, that it went up to 3,500 in April, and 4,700 missions in May. But it also has something to do with the type of bombing. Now, only about 3 days ago, I was engaging in an argument with somebody from the State Department. It came about because I had to have contact with him in connection with the release of these 3 American pilots that you may have read about in the press recently. And I've had contact with him as well as Averell Harriman and Cyrus Vance and some of the others in Paris. And I said, now, I think it's better to leave him anonymous, but in effect what I said to him was, why don't you stop the bombing? You keep complaining that the talks aren't getting anywhere, and you know and I know that the talks will not proceed. There will be no serious negotiations until the United States stops the bombing. And what is all this coming on, claiming that somehow or other you have de-escalated, when all you've done is shift the bombing from one area to another? And I didn't even go into the Herman Kahn proposal that it would be more effective militarily to bomb this area from Vinh south. But I said, Secretary McNamara himself said that the bombing was a failure, that it was not accomplishing its purposes. So how can you therefore discontinue a part of it and say, now we've made a peace gesture, so the Vietnamese must come through and make a parallel gesture. It's their turn. And he said to me, well, the kind of bombing that Secretary McNamara said was a failure has been discontinued. So behind it all lies this shift in military policy, not in the form of de-escalation, but in the form of what they consider to be a more effective type of bombing. Now, in this article, Herman Kahn said, quote, such a change in bombing policy can be presented in a variety of ways, ranging from a fairly major concession to North Vietnam and the critics of bombing to a minor de-escalation. Well, now, perhaps I should add one thing to that, because it gives us some foretaste of what may happen if we don't bring enough pressure, if enough other things don't happen. He then goes on to say that in the event we want to make a significant escalation, it appears to me that the invasion and occupation of some or all of the area south of Vinh would be more useful than other forms of escalation that have been discussed. But we know this old business about keeping the options open. So this form of shifting the bombing to Vinh and the area of South and increasing the tonnage and increasing the number of missions can be passed off as an escalation, as a de-escalation, either to lull the anti-war movement and the anti-war sentiment into apathy and acquiescence, or it can actually be the preparation for a very serious escalation. Now, the military's been wrong so many times that Kahn's analysis won't necessarily turn out to be right. But he believes that it would be possible for the United States, having softened up this area where they're now concentrating the bombing, to land troops there without bringing China in or without bringing a significant escalation on the part of the Soviet Union. So it's very possible that this is what is actually being prepared today. Although myself, I'm a little ambivalent about that. I prefer to think of it in terms of the fact that this is another case of keeping the options open. That is, it becomes a kind of symbolic peace gesture without weakening the United States militarily, but it also can lead to a very serious escalation if they decide at the last moment or at whatever moment they decide to go ahead with it. Now, the Vietnamese are no fools about these things, and although at the time I was in Paris, I didn't know about this Herman Kahn article, for example, and I myself had not analyzed the thing through to the extent that I now have, although I was suspicious. But the Vietnamese immediately said to me, what the United States has done is to improve its military position and at the same time to get credit for an act of peace. And what they're doing, having improved their military position and having made a symbolic but false gesture toward peace, they're saying, okay, now it's your turn. What will you do in response to our peace gesture? So obviously they reject this completely as being an impossible approach. Now, on this question of reciprocity, this seems to be, on one level of diplomatic warfare, this is the level on which the present talks are hung up. The Vietnamese have said their policy for 2 years has been, we will not negotiate, we will not have serious talks until the bombing stops. The United States made this gesture, which I've tried to analyze a little bit, and said, okay, now it's your turn to reciprocate by giving us something in turn before we stop the rest of the bombing. The Vietnamese response is, first of all, in response to what? And I've been through that analysis a little bit in terms of whether it was a genuine or a false gesture. But then secondly, by principle, by patriotic principle, by moral and ethical principle, the Vietnamese say, how can you have reciprocity between an aggressor and his victim? How can you ask us to stop trying to get the hated occupying power off our soil? They continually make the comparison, which I think is a very valid one historically, with the American Revolution. Would George Washington, would the, almost use the word Minutemen, I grew up in Lexington and Concord where Minutemen was a heroic word. But anyway, would the American revolutionists, would they have reciprocated with King George and the British, short of having the British leave their military occupation and their political control of the United States? As a matter of fact, they would have in the early stages, but as the war progressed and more people became convinced of the principle of independence, they wouldn't. The Vietnamese are in that situation. And I don't know if it was reported out here, but Sven Thuy, the chief Vietnamese negotiator, made a statement after weeks of frustration. He made a statement in Paris, which the Americans considered an insult, but the Vietnamese kept citing to me as being an accurate presentation of their position. Namely, the only valid reciprocity is that if you stop bombing our soil, we will continue not to bomb your soil. And if you withdraw your troops from our homeland, we will continue not to have our troops in your homeland. So I say the Americans were insulted, said, well, these aren't serious talks when they talk that way, so forth, but it is an actual parallel of the way the Vietnamese feel, and I believe the way they feel quite correctly. Now, what the Vietnamese say as a substitute, if I can use that word, they say that we are as anxious for peace as you are. In fact, we're far more anxious for peace than almost anybody in the United States. After all, it's our villages that are being bombed, our people that are being killed, our country which is being occupied by a foreign power. Therefore, we will do all kinds of things in order to make it easier for the United States to make peace. They're also very conscious. I think it's quite interesting how conscious they are of the fact that the United States is a big power that has to save its face. You know, we always speak about the Oriental habit of saving face, whereas it's the United States which is trying to save face and needs to save face in this situation. So they say we will do everything possible to make it easy for the United States to save its face and to withdraw with a minimum of political embarrassment. So what they say is we cannot have reciprocity, because by principle that's wrong, but because we are anxious for peace, we will commit commit a series of acts of goodwill which will communicate to the American people how serious we are for peace, and communicate that we're not trying to humiliate anybody, not even President Johnson. They seem to have less bitterness. It's quite strange. They have less bitterness to our political leaders that have led us into this morass, less bitterness to the American soldiers, whom they consider to be victims along with themselves, less bitterness in either of these areas than many Americans do. And as they say, they want to make it as easy as possible. So the first thing that they've done, which they consider an act of goodwill, is that although they've said for 2 years there can be no negotiations without an end to the bombing, they nonetheless took President Johnson's phony speech and they took it seriously enough, on the surface at least, to bring a negotiating team for Paris, you might say poised on the brink, ready to negotiate as soon as the United States showed its good faith by actually stopping the bombing. Now the second thing, and this is not a quote, for one thing, my conversations with both some of my conversations with the Vietnamese and with the Americans, with Harriman and Vance, were off the record, but I try to walk a thin line of drawing some substance without quotations and so forth. But this next point that the Vietnamese speak of, in all accuracy, they speak in rather veiled and sometimes puzzling terms. And it's a kind of situation where, for example, I say, well, is this what you mean? Or somebody seems to think that this is what happened, and they say, well, you're very smart, or something like that. So I don't want to overstate this, and I think that there are probably political reasons why the Vietnamese do not want to be quoted on this point, or quite to say it, but they certainly lead a series of people, including myself, to believe it. And that is that they withdrew the siege on Khe Sanh. And that what happened, of course, was then when the Americans began to realize that there was an actual de-escalation at Khe Sanh, and they sent up a rescue force. If you remember, for about a week, or maybe it was 4 or 5 days, I don't remember precisely, there were articles in the paper, dispatches from Vietnam, expressing surprise that the troops, the American Marines, were meeting so little resistance as they went up there. And then they went up there and they lifted the siege. And the Vietnamese indicate that this was, quote, an act of goodwill on their part, which they were not committed to in terms of reciprocity, but which they thought would show the Americans their seriousness about having peace, about ending the war. But immediately the American military announced this as a military victory for the United States. So now when the Vietnamese speak about reciprocity, they not only speak on the principled level, that a victim cannot make reciprocal acts with the aggressor. But they also say, besides, it isn't practical. Because if we say, all right, you do this and we'll do that, then the American military will be able to befuddle the American public, will be able to claim that we didn't live up to the terms and that they actually made some kind of a military victory. And incidentally, while I'm saying this, They, of course, have a whole series of specific incidents along this line. I mentioned the business of release of prisoners, which I've been involved in with the Vietnamese. And the fact is that in the early days, the NLF used to release prisoners, used to talk to the prisoners about the fact that they had no bitterness against the American people. And they used to take the prisoners and let them go outside of an American military encampment. But every time they did this, then it was announced in the press, and there were more incidents than even reached the United States, but in Saigon and so forth, it was announced either that these prisoners had escaped, and then they told horror stories about the conditions that they had been in, or it was announced that the Americans or the South Vietnamese had captured a prison and liberated them. And that is the beginning, by the way, that's the genesis of this present situation, whereby they release prisoners to the anti-war movement, and they announce it ahead of time and so forth. But anyway, on this whole business, that's their second argument against reciprocity, namely that they cannot trust the Americans to interpret correctly, and that they have a difficult time getting through to the American people and letting them know what actually is happening. But also, that's the second, quote, act of goodwill that I want to cite, namely the relieving of the siege of Khe Sanh, which was then misinterpreted. Now, the third thing that they point out as a sign of their flexibility, that they really don't want to roast the Americans, but they want to have things worked out, is the fact that they no longer speak of the NLF as the sole representative of the South Vietnamese people. In fact, they've set up, I'm sure you've seen about it in the papers, the Alliance of Nationalist, Democratic, and Peace Forces. And this is a follow-through from the NLF program, which was announced on September 7th of 1967. By the way, was unveiled during this Bratislava conference between American anti-war people and Vietnamese that you referred to. Now, in that program, they announced that any South Vietnamese who wanted to join the patriotic forces would be welcome without punishment and without recrimination, even though they had been agents of the Americans. And they followed this up by setting up this new factor, the Alliance of Nationalist, Democratic, and Peace Forces, which again made it easier for people who had been anti-NLF in the past, either third force people, Buddhists and whatnot, or even within the Key, was at that time the Key and the Key Tier governments. It made it easier for them to come into some new organization. Now at Bratislava we had a lot of horseplay. You know, I wish that everything was as sharp and clear in these things in the form of communication as it might be. But there was a lot of horseplay about this new program that they unveiled while we were there, and I had a hard time understanding what it was, but gradually a pattern began to develop. I mean, they used to grin and say to us, well, how do you interpret this new program? And then we'd talk a while and say, well, do you think it's a constitution? And then we'd get into speculation about whether this was the constitution for a new government, a shadow government, which was to replace the Key Tier government. And I don't know if I'm getting that across to you adequately, but out of it all, this went on off and on for a week, and then it was resumed when I saw the Vietnamese in Havana in January, just before the Tet offensive. Now, when, by the way, in a similar way, I realized afterwards, and Jim Higgins of the York, Pennsylvania Gazette and Daily said to me on the phone, well, for Christ's sake, they told us about the Tet offensive yesterday, and we weren't smart enough to know about it. But I think you can understand reasons why talking with people from the enemy country, why they indulge a little bit in this kind of thing. But anyway, it went on there. Now, what I've added up, and this is one of those areas that came to a head in Paris where I became convinced that it was true, is that they feel that militarily and politically they are strong enough to set up a shadow government or an alternate government, to announce a constitution and to proceed on that basis. But that they have refrained from doing this because of the fact that they realize that there are always complicated negotiations, ego factors, prestige factors, political factors of one kind or another, which enter into negotiations at the time that peace is being made. Therefore, what they've done is to come out with something which could be modified or expanded into a constitution, and they've set up a framework, this National Alliance, which could become the core of the new government. But they've left it open so that, for example, once they're convinced that the Americans are committed to military withdrawal, that if need be, somebody can be added who will be very important back here. Secretary Rusk or Hubert or whoever is attempting to befuddle us at the moment will be able to say, to cover up the defeat, really, and to cover, which is what it is, be able to say, well, you see, they admitted Pham That Tien into the cabinet, or whoever it is. He's a he's a member of the government. So really, you see, we haven't been just forced out disgracefully. So with the Vietnamese are much more conscious of that and much less purist of that type of thing than a lot of people in the anti-war movement, because they are engaged in the life and death struggle to defend not only their lives but also their homeland. And there was a famous statement which Ho made to me and Ho Chi Minh and to a number of other people also, that when the Americans decided to leave, that they would put on a festival. They would escort the soldiers down to the boats with flowers and with dancing girls and so forth. And this represents something fairly serious. They really want to accomplish the objective, and they don't want to get hung up on ego factors or symbolic factors or doctrinaire factors. They're willing to do things which don't sacrifice their homeland. Now, the other part of this program which relates to this is that they call for a South Vietnam which is a neutral, unaligned, or non-aligned country. Not country, I beg your pardon, because this is a very fundamental point that there aren't two countries over there, South and North. It would be a non-aligned, neutralist section of Vietnam until reunification. And reunification, then what it'll be like, has to be worked out between the North and the South. Now, when I was in Paris, and this is one of those things I hesitated about for a while, but I decided finally it was all right to talk about. But when I was talking to Sven Thuy, the chief Vietnamese negotiator, and he was saying quite correctly that the talks mean nothing, we're getting tired of going there, we have nothing more to say, everything is very clear, they've got to stop the bombing and then everything can start, but until they do, nothing will happen. Harriman talks about the coffee breaks and talks about once we get private talks, everything will be better, but the fact is they won't be any different when we have private talks than we are public talks. The United States must stop the bombing before anything happens. When he was going through this, then he began to get agitated or excited in a different way, and he said, but you tell Harriman that the minute they stop the bombing, that we're ready to discuss all subjects. And he sort of leaned forward when he said all. And he said, problems of the South, problems of the North, and problems of the whole of Southeast Asia. Well, I don't know if I'm just not very smart or what, but the fact is, and I was with another American, Bob Greenblatt from the National Mobilization Committee, we were a little confused why he got so excited by this. His eyes lit up and his face became animated and he repeated it. And we had some theories. But anyway, it just happened that the next day we were talking to Ambassador Harriman, and we said this. We decided to repeat it. We weren't really acting as messengers in most cases, but anyway, we thought this was urgent, and we told him. And to my utter amazement, Harriman leaned forward, and he began to get agitated, and his eyes began to light up, and he questioned us in detail in one thing or another. Well, what it adds up to then, as I found out in subsequent talks, is that the Vietnamese are saying, and they made this very specific, that they will discuss with the United States economic and cultural relations. Now, this is an outgrowth of the non-aligned neutral bloc in the South. In other words, that they look forward to economic and cultural relations with the United States. It's not an Iron Curtain situation where the two blocs, maintain no relations, but they want peaceful relations to be implemented through trade and other factors. Now, I don't know about you, but this made me nervous because, you know, where the American dollar goes, generally American influence and control goes. And I myself am opposed not only to the United States being policemen all over the world, which I think is a rather polite way of putting it, but we're really the exploiter of the natural resources and the populations of most of the globe. And I'm not for an American presence in Southeast Asia if it means a continuation of that kind of thing. And I remember when I was in Cambodia, for example, how people told me that Cambodia only began to progress economically when it cut off American economic aid, because with the American economic aid went the American way of life. In other words, just like we tried to control in Saigon and South Vietnam, first through diplomacy and later through advisors and finally through a full-scale invasion, we also try to control those countries through our economic aid. So this kind of thing makes me nervous. But in terms of the context, and in my case I try to put together a number of things that have come from my visits to Hanoi and my contacts with the Vietnamese. What has happened is they have been fighting for their lives, for their independence. Well, you know, you can start it way back, but at the very least since 1946, when they issued their Declaration of Independence, and when the occupying Allied forces, which were under control of the British Labour Party, by the way, released the captured Japanese soldiers, rearmed them, and let them loose on the Vietnamese to try to put down the independence movement. That was the beginning of America's and Britain's betrayal of the Pacific Charter, which they had told the Vietnamese that, you know, they favored and so forth, independence for small nations. But they've been fighting for their life against this kind of thing at least from 1946 on. And during the latter years of this, they have been basically dependent for their military supplies, their ability to have any kind of equipment to fight with, on three sources: the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. In the United States, of course, they still get a heavy percentage of their weapons captured from the United States, unexploded bombs which they turn into mines and so forth. But the main thing is that during this period, they have no capacity for manufacturing any technological weaponry. They're tremendous at using beehives and traps and tunnels and all kinds of things of that kind. But in terms of guns and anti-aircraft, so they're dependent upon China and the Soviet Union. But now, for the last few years, what they've done is they've increasingly asserted their independence from both China and the Soviet Union. Now, it's very clear that they're as anxious to remain independent from their friends as they are from their enemies. And it's very clear that on a number of occasions they have, I don't know if defied is exactly the right word, but they have disagreed with what either China or the Soviet Union wanted, and they've held their position. And I think that out of this, they have developed the confidence that a small country who has right on its side can actually stand up to a big power. And I think maybe I should give some examples. I won't go into the political ones that you probably know anyway. Things like coming to the talks, although China indicated that it disapproved, or things like not negotiating on the terms and conditions which the Soviet Union obviously has been favoring for some time. Just pass over those by reference only. But, for example, when I was in Moscow on my way to Vietnam, the Russians complained to me that the Vietnamese were handicapped militarily because they wouldn't allow Soviet technicians to accompany and operate the SAMs, the surface-to-air missiles against the airplanes. When I was in Vietnam, they told me with great pride and elation that they had turned the SAMs into more effective instruments than the Russians had designed and developed them for, that they had made them much more mobile, for example. And they confided that the Russians really don't understand people's war. They still think like one of the superpowers in terms of electronic and technological equipment and do not understand the decentralized, diversified people's war. Well, through a whole series of experiences of this kind, I think they've developed the confidence that they can actually trade with the United States without becoming subservient to us, without American political control following. Now, of course, one of the factors in this is that with the breakup of the so-called monolithic communist empire, which never was quite that monolithic, I think, although there were certainly centralized controls in Europe coming out of Moscow. But anyway, with the breakdown in that, and also in the corresponding contradictions in the Western camp, and corresponding problems which for the United States, which for example can be symbolized by Sweden. Sweden, the country perhaps most like the United States in the world, welcoming deserters and defying American diplomacy and so forth. With this kind of breakup of the world and the major power blocks, I think in addition to their concrete experience during this war, the Vietnamese are quite convinced that they can accept not aid, but they can accept trade and similar relationships with the United States without becoming their cat's paw. Now, I think I ought to stop for questions, but I'd just like to maybe in stopping refer to, well, I'll try to make them quick because I think I'd like to have dialogue for those who can stay. But just in summary, without going into it, the one difference at Paris compared to previous simultaneous peace gestures and military escalations put forward by the United States. The one difference is that the United States today is defeated militarily in Vietnam. And the reason, for example, there's all this fighting in the cities is that there's very little else of Vietnam to fight over anymore because it's under the control of the NLF. And let me remind you that the French won a military victory in Algeria, but in the process of winning it, they so alienated all of the Algerians and also world public opinion that even after they scored a military victory, they had to withdraw from Algeria. The United States has succeeded in alienating and antagonizing the entire Vietnamese population across the board, whatever their politics, religion, or anything else, without winning a military victory. And I think that this has to be balanced against the kind of thing which I referred to from Herman Kahn when one is speculating whether the next step is going to be a major escalation or actually some move toward withdrawal. Now I think the second decisive factor in that, in addition to the military scene in Vietnam, is going to be the political scene in the United States. Numerically, money-wise, technologically, the United States could continue to send over hundreds of thousands and millions of troops. But the question is whether politically they can do it or not. And I think that's why they're hung up where they are right now. Because the political repercussions, the repercussions internationally are so great from this kind of escalation. So I think that if there is to be an escalation, it will be accompanied by a destruction of the framework of democracy and by a kind of repression which only our black communities know about today. A kind of terror and suppression of democratic rights, an introduction of something very close to fascism. But if the war is to come to an end, apart from what the Vietnamese are doing in defense of their homeland, the most significant factor is whether the American public and the American anti-war movement specifically come into active protest and resistance again. Now, there's a lot going on now, yes, but there has been, I think, a certain sagging in a lot of people, at least, a feeling, well, after all, the war is almost over and the talks are going on and so forth, but the real pressure and the longer I was in Paris, the more I felt this. The real pressure to stop the war is not these secret meetings and so forth in Paris, but the revolt of the American people against the war. Now, I think that there's a unique opportunity here in Los Angeles when Hubert comes on Sunday. I think that we have a message to get across that there can be no tranquility, no peace in the United States as long as there is no peace in Vietnam. And there's another thing coming up later, the Democratic Nominating Convention. I think that whether one supports a candidate or is skeptical of all candidates, I think that we can agree that only the pressure of people in the streets and the people refusing to cooperate with the military, the people saying there can be no peace here if there is no peace in Vietnam, only this kind of thing can in the end stop the war, whether it gets mediated through some candidate who signs the treaty or does something, or some politician. I think it's only the pressure of direct action which brought a McCarthy, for example, out into the anti-war movement. A lot of people say, well, you know, after all, we must give McCarthy credit because he's the one who forced Johnson to resign. Well, look behind McCarthy to the people who were at the Pentagon, especially to the resistance people, to the soldiers who deserted, to the soldiers who wouldn't accept arms, to the people who came out in Los Angeles in that bloody scene last year. Look to those people as the people who flushed out a McCarthy. So I hope that in addition to what you do here with Humphrey, what you do in the resistance and other anti-military activities, I hope that you'll talk and think seriously, sending a very large delegation to Chicago, where that's where the action's going to be, August 23rd to 28th.
Before we go on with any questions, I'm going to ask Mr. Dellinger to announce any additional speaking engagements he might have during his visit out here, which you people might be interested in before you leave.
Gotta find them.
Coming up with the Humphrey thing. If you have to make a choice, it's better to greet Humphrey than to listen to me again. I'll tell you that. Oh yes, tonight at 8 o'clock in the Fritchman Auditorium, 8th and Vermont. I guess that's the Unitarian Church. San Diego, it's a long way off. Santa Barbara. Long Beach First Congregational Church, July 26th. That's Friday night at 8 o'clock.
Okay, we're going to have a question and answer period now. I'll ask those of you who have to premise your questions with a statement to keep this statement very brief so that we can get in as many questions and have as much dialogue as possible. Yes, right here.
You said that the North Vietnamese decided to talk in Paris, making it easier to talk in the United States and to stop the destruction in their own country. Now, for that, they've had to pay in that the bombing has been improved, the quality has improved as well as the quantity. And, of course, McCarthy is in a much worse position as a result of the talks that are going on than he might have been otherwise. Now, I don't know, maybe I think there's more of a difference between McCarthy and Humphrey than the North Vietnamese do, but do you think that on the balance they have not played into Johnson and Humphrey's hands and have made a wise decision?
Well, first let me say, before speculating, same thing that I say about a lot of decisions in the black community. I think it's very hard for somebody who really is not on the receiving end as a victim to know what is right for the victims to do. it's good to analyze. I'm not opposing it, but we have to do it with a certain humility. And I was appalled, for example, when somebody whose name I won't mention, because he has made some very important contributions, I think, to the anti-war and anti-imperialist struggle. But somebody in New York, where I come from, when the Vietnamese announced that they were going to Paris, he said, well, that's, in effect, this is a paraphrase, that's the way it goes. We struggle and sweat and sacrifice, and the Vietnamese sell us out. So let's just bear that in mind. But they're the only ones who, in a sense, have a right to decide how much they're going to resist and what are honorable peace terms and what aren't. And in the past, you see, it's been just the opposite. The anti-war movement has been a little perplexed and angry at the Vietnamese that they were so adamant. You know, why don't you respond? I don't know how many times, because I was known to have some contacts with the Vietnamese, how many times I was asked to send telegrams or to go to Phnom Penh or Hanoi or somewhere to explain to the Vietnamese why they should now negotiate. You know, the American anti-war movement kept thinking that they should. And as a matter of fact, the anti-war movement would not have deepened its understanding of the nature of American society and of the nature of struggle we have if the Vietnamese had negotiated on some of those early terms. But that was a windfall. Now, first of all, the change in the bombing policy took place regardless of whether the Vietnamese came to Paris or not. So they didn't sanction that, or I think, they didn't authorize it by coming there. Secondly, I think that any serious social movement, and I guess it's more superficial aspects too, always go up and down unevenly. Now let's hope that, you know, in general it's going up, but there have to be lulls and relaxations. In the military campaign, the same kind of thing happens. But when Johnson made his speech, there was a brief period in which I think he did demoralize a lot of the anti-war movement, or demoralize isn't quite the correct word, I think. He diverted it and distracted it. It did serve as a sedative. But then it reached a point when no sight was being set. And when the State Department very cleverly, I think, was running this campaign of proposing 46 different sites, you know, and Americans were too ignorant to know that, for example, when it proposed Burma, you know, which sounded so liberal to us, because there it was way over there meeting amongst those funny people in their home territory and, you know, all kinds of things of that kind, that there was kind of strained relations between China and Burma that for Vietnam to accept would have been an insult to China. Although, as I say, they disagree with and maintain their independent policy. There's no sense in starting off your peace talks by antagonizing your friends. Anyway, the United States carried on a very clever campaign this way, making it appear as if the Vietnamese were intransigent and the United States was leaning all over itself to make peace. But it didn't work. And after a little less than a month, there began to build up again an anger which was about to explode, and a realization that the United States was frustrating talks. Now, it's my prediction, which I'm doing my best to make a self-fulfilling prediction. It's my prediction that the American people are reaching the point where they're going to explode in anger and resistance again, because the true reality is going to come out, namely that the United States is using the talks as a facade, but that basically they're a fraud. And that I think that feeling is building up. So,
It's got to come out in a month.
what?
It's got to come out by the middle of next month.
Well, there you get into the candidates. You see, you say it has to, by that you mean so that McCarthy will get the nomination. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you see, I tried to be as gentle as possible in this area, because I do believe that we have to work together. And I believe that, for example, our major actions, like greeting Hubert, should include people who have no faith in McCarthy and people who do. But I can tell you that it's not my belief that whether McCarthy is nominated or not is going to make a major difference in American foreign policy. I think, as I already indicated, that he only began to come alive to the extent that he came alive as a result of the social and political context in the United States. I think that politicians, including McCarthy, there are honest ones and there are dishonest ones, but basically they're responsive individuals rather than initiatory individuals. And I think that if there hadn't been any anti-war movement, McCarthy wouldn't be making the statements that he is today. Secondly, one has to face the fact that you can compare him favorably in a lot of points with Hubert Humphrey. See, even Hubert Humphrey now, he tried that business of leaking, that he didn't really go along with Johnson, and so forth. But anyway, you've got to look at that debate between McCarthy and Kennedy, and here was Gene McCarthy making some good statements, but also saying that although we've got to get out of Vietnam and we have so forth, saying, but we do have commitments which we must honor, such as to the nationalist Chinese. And his chief complaint about Johnson's relationships with de Gaulle and the French were that Johnson should have been able to handle it so that de Gaulle wouldn't have expelled NATO. So I believe that just like in the Johnson, we have this terrible need to believe that there's somebody carrying our battle for us, somebody who understands up there. Rocky Graziano, somebody up there likes me. Well, somebody up there is working for us, and it's part of the way we've been brought up about the United States. We have to believe that somehow you can get a candidate or a senator or a president who's really going to do the job for us. But I think that, it's debatable, but I think that one could make a case, I think I could make a good case, and a lot of people could, that McCarthy is no more reliable than Adlai Stevenson was. See, I happen to have gone through the Adlai Stevenson campaigns. Beautiful man, beautiful speaker, beautiful ideals, and all the rest. He ended up by being the government's official liar at the UN. And to the American people, whether it was on the Bay of Pigs or on Vietnam. And anyway, the more fundamental thing is nobody else can do our job for us. If we do our job properly, then some government officials will respond and maybe even help us. Maybe there'll be some dialogue of interaction going on. But without the leverage that comes from a people's peace movement similar to the People's War, I think we're running for disaster when we concentrate on any political candidate, even if it was Jesus Christ or Karl Marx.
Les?
I wondered if maybe you could clear up what seems to me to be a contradiction. You gave the example of the withdrawal of the NLS from peace on, and you said that there were two reactions. One, the troops were surprised with the lack of resistance on the way up the hill, and two, the reporters in the United States were surprised at the lack of resistance. And you said that you believed, although you weren't sure, that the main reason that they withdrew was to give the United States this chance, this way out, or whatever. If that was the case, don't you think that they would have made it very clear to top men in the military that they were withdrawing on purpose, not because they were losing, and that they also would have made this clear to the reporters in order to make that sort of withdrawal?
Yeah, no, I understand that contradiction, and I tried to just, in a sense, imply a little of this before. But these things are always very complicated and very different from the point of view of somebody on the spot. Now, one of the complications is that the most important thing in the world to the Vietnamese is their dignity and self-reliance. And for example, I found out that when I was in North Vietnam, and sometimes, whole city, we were in a city that had just been wiped out, or we went into a place and there were bombs dropping all around, that they were no more angry than on other occasions when a reconnaissance plane went over, was violating their airspace, was, you see, an insult to their sovereignty and their dignity. These are very, I think, very understandable and laudable attitudes. Now, you put that together with the fact that they affirm their absolute right to defend their homeland against any foreign aggressor and any occupying power. In a very delicate position to begin to trumpet the fact that they're stopping resistance, they're letting some American troops off the hook. Now, the closest way to maybe think of that, although I don't know, you see, because maybe people who weren't alive during World War II, it doesn't mean that much either. But in France, or any of the European countries that were occupied by the Nazis, see, it would be quite a political thing at a certain point for the resistance movement to announce that they had spared a contingent of Nazis because they had hopes of peace, or because they were humanitarian, or whatever it was. Now, I happen to believe that there are times, when one should do that, no matter who the enemy is. And I think the Vietnamese have demonstrated that they do too. But it's not a one-dimensional thing. It's a very complicated thing. And so the result is, I think, that they've made, I think, fairly clear that this is what happened. But they don't want to make a big hassle over it.
And then their objective hasn't been met. I mean, there's no point in doing it. Why spare it?
Well, you see, the way I introduced this actually was that they say this is why we cannot say if you do this, we'll do that, because then the American military, which is completely unreliable, will say to the American people that we broke our promise. Their objectives haven't been met, but I mean, they haven't been met through 30 years of fighting for their independence. Why did they sign the Geneva Accords, for example? They had won the war. They basically set up something which kept the foot of the West in the door. The United States has used it, you see, to reopen the war against their independence. I don't think you have the option of always doing the thing which succeeds completely, particularly when you have a live and ambitious enemy.
Yes, sir. Right over there. Right.
I need to ask if you have an explanation about fighting in and around Saigon after Week 3, where these border attacks have been described and really seem to be more or less random destruction and terror. What is the purpose? What is the outcome?
Well, as I suggested earlier, I think they're fighting for the cities as the last stronghold of the Americans. I don't want to pose as knowing more than I do. I don't know if I'm qualified to judge whether the attacks are random or precise. And it makes me nervous when the Vietnamese say that they are precise attacks in areas where the Vietnamese have been asked to leave, because it reminds me of the American bombing claims to precision and that they always warned people to leave. I say that despite the distinction I obviously draw between the victim and the aggressor. When I talked to the Vietnamese in Paris about this, that is exactly what they said, namely that they're aimed at the military and communications nerve centers of the Americans in Saigon, and that they have warned all Vietnamese to stay out of those areas. Well, actually, apart from Tan Son Nhut and certain direct military things, it's a very small section in Saigon, in the center of Saigon, where the American military political complex is holed up, and this is where the mortars have been going. But the third thing is that the mobilization committee sent 2 people to Paris to testify before the French section of the International War Crimes Tribunal on July 11th. And the purpose was to testify before the assembled international press and really to deal with this very question that had been raised originally by Harriman, that is about the blood coming, the indiscriminate mortars on civilians and so forth. And one of these was a Quaker visa worker, medical aid worker, who'd been in Vietnam for 18 months, was in Pleiku at the time of the Tet Offensive, and in Saigon in the May Offensive. And I spent a day with him the day after he got back from Vietnam. And he said that to him, to anybody to all the Vietnamese, there was absolutely no question who was causing the deaths to the civilians in Saigon. That the overwhelming, he kept saying that people, conservatives say 90%, but it's much more than that. 90% of the slaughter, the destruction, is coming from the B-52 bombing, from the helicopter fire ships, from the napalm, and so forth, and that this is just a complete red herring, attributing it...
You're talking about the street fighting during the Tet Offensive.
I'm talking about the Tet Offensive and afterward, right. We also sent an American soldier who left there on April 11th and had much to say along the same lines. And the fascinating thing to me is that with all that press over there speculating on the meaning of every time Van Thuy coughs at a coffee break, or whether he has 2 cups of tea or 1, or drinks Chinese tea or Indian tea and so forth, with all of them there wasn't one line reported back to the United States, at least that got into the press, of the testimony of these 2 people on something which related directly to the American charges at the talks.
Yes, sir, back here.
No.
We would hear that they did contact the coastal town. No soldiers involved. I'm not sure exactly how many people they killed, but there were quite a few. There were 1,000 people that were homeless. And Marines were pinned down in the base nearby. They weren't in the city. They had them pinned down, and they were doing. So what about that? What about also about those news correspondents that were killed in the street during the thing? There was a lot more things.
Yeah.
Making it black, not making it black and white. I mean,
Yeah.
you're saying one side.
No. Well, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because let me just try to explain my own position a little bit. First of all, I am a pacifist in the extreme sense of the word. I believe that we have to use and develop nonviolent methods. And I think that we're in terrible trouble if we don't. The only problem is that pacifism and nonviolence have been associated with kind of a weak-kneed, moderate position. And I think that Martin Luther King, martyr or not, and some good things or not, for example, helped contribute to that sense that in the end the nonviolent people always make some kind of a deal, so forth. But I believe that, and I am as appalled as you apparently are whenever I read of people being killed this way, whoever does it. But the second thing that I put with that is something which I think I've implied or stated indirectly during this, is that I don't think that the member of the dominant class and the aggressor country in this case, the dominant color and class in relation to black-white, has the right to dictate or to be self-righteous toward the victim as to the methods that he uses. I mean, it's just beyond our ability. All right. Well, all right. Now, when it comes to Vietnam, I apply that you have to put it in the context, I think, that I described, like of the Nazis, and that I think that what they feel is that they have to do a certain amount of this. They are, after all, fighting a violent war, and all right. Excuse me. Try to make it.
No, you're keeping one side of being brutal and committing atrocities against humanity, and yet you're closing your eyes to the other side.
No, I'm not.
And you're saying you're justifying, well, they're there, it's their home and something like that. And they have a right.
Well, don't you think it makes a difference?
Yeah, but they're killing their own people. South Vietnamese aren't Americans, really. Let's be realistic about it. The South Vietnamese people that are in the country there, in Saigon, when they were killing those people.
Well, first of all, as I tried to say to the questioner over here, anybody who, except the press, by the way, and we'll get to that because that's part of your question, But like my Quaker friend who was over there for 18 months, he says that and he was working in the American-occupied Arvin sectors, in the hospitals and so forth. He says that there were none of his Vietnamese friends, he spoke Vietnamese and all the rest, none of his Vietnamese friends who had any question that it is the United States which is killing practically all of the civilians who are killed. I mean, this is, I can't prove that, but there is just a...
Make a statement you can't prove.
No, you're excuse me, but you're being extraordinarily superficial when you say that, because most of life cannot be proved. What one does, and I would not want to be the dogmatic kind of speaker who claims that he can prove these things. What I can do is to show you, and I'll give you documents, evidence after evidence after evidence. But what I cannot prove, for example, is statistically exactly how much are killed by one and how much by the other. But now it's not irrelevant to bring out not only that the United States is an invading power, but that it actually has the kind of weaponry and the kind of technology which is destroying the country. Now, the final thing, and we should let somebody else get into this probably, but the final thing is I remind you that Senator Stephen Young of Ohio came back from Saigon over a year ago, I think it was about a year and a half ago, and he announced that the CIA was using, quote, loyal South Vietnamese, that means puppet South Vietnamese, using them to pose as Viet Cong and to commit arson, murder, and rape. Now, I know that when the Montagnard village was attacked by the Viet Cong, supposedly, in January, I think that was, that I was shocked by that as it appeared in the press. Now, the Vietnamese that I've talked to, and again, I cannot prove this, but there are many things which make me tend to believe them. They claim that this also was done by the Arvin Special Forces and not by themselves. Now, in the end, one can't sort out all of these things. I'm sure there is brutality on both sides. There is violence on both sides. But I think that anybody who uses these instances, which are trumpeted up in the American press, to make some kind of vague equality between the two, well, they're all violent, or they're all inhuman, or all doing this kind of thing, misses the nature of this war, and also misses what to me is just the shocking, in the positive sense, shocking thing about the Vietnamese, about how they have managed to maintain a kind of humanitarian attitude in the middle of this war. I cited Ho and the Vietnamese and their attitude toward the prisoners. I'll give one example, and then I will stop, so if others want to go elsewhere. But when the day that we had that activity at the Pentagon last fall, there was an American soldier who was tear-gassed and clubbed in Detroit at a parallel action that was going on. And the reason that he took part in that action was because he had been in Vietnam. He learned a little bit about the war, but he had one specific experience, that he was wounded in a battle and he was in the brush. And when the Viet Cong were withdrawing, why, I forget it was one or two at the moment, but I think it was two Viet Cong stopped and dragged him out into the open in the clearing so that he would be seen when the helicopters came over. And this guy, felt that he owed his life to them and that therefore he also owed it to fight against them. Now, I'm not saying that they all do that. I'm sure that there are people there who cut your throat in a similar situation. This is the nature, I think, of the kind of war that has happened there. But the thing that surprises me is not the thing that surprises me is the extent of the humanitarian and understanding attitude which the Vietnamese have preserved, and which was very hard for the Americans to preserve, or for the French to preserve, or for any of the Europeans to preserve in the fight against the Nazis.
Mr. Dellinger, thank you very much for your presentation today. I think we'll wrap it up at this point, and any of you wishing to pursue any further comment or questions, try and see Mr. Dellinger aside. Thank you very much for coming today, and